Hello, folks, and welcome back to Tomaskycast. That's a production of New Republic Video. I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of the New Republic, and I am joined today. We're taping this Friday morning at about 11:30 by Andrew Weiss. Andrew is the James Family Chair and Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he oversees research on Russia and Eurasia. He's also the Library of Congress Chair in U.S.-Russia relations. Yes, that sounds impressive and is impressive. He used to be on the staff of the National Security Council. He used to work at the State Department. He is one of our leading, what we used to call in the Cold War days, a Russia hand. And we're very excited to have him to share his knowledge and wisdom with us. Andrew, hi there.
Hey, Michael. So nice to see you again.
Likewise. Thanks a lot for joining us. So let's start in. As I said, it's Friday morning, East Coast time. You have your ear to the ground. What's the latest? What are you hearing?
So I'm not going to be probably the best resource for breaking news. I did see headlines or a small Twitter thread by someone named Jeff Selden, who I would encourage everybody to start following on Twitter. He's a VOA national security correspondent, and he attends a lot of briefings. And the Pentagon just did a briefing in the last, I'd say, 45 minutes. And they basically just indicated that they thought that the Russians probably were not making as much progress in their assault on Ukraine as they had anticipated, that various parts of the plan was maybe getting more bogged down. It's obviously early days. We're just on day 2 of this, and that a significant portion of the Russian forces are still in reserve, so they haven't thrown everything they've got into this war. The images that you're seeing are horrible. This is not just the kind of whatever you want to call it, like 1990s era U.S. high-tech war. This is something much more indiscriminate and clumsy. That's a reflection both of the Russian appetite for civilians getting hurt, and just their lack of finesse. And then it's a testament to the bravery of Ukrainians. And I mean, I literally just a second ago, I'm watching on my other screen here, my favorite thing, which is a channel called Current Time, or Nastoящее время. And on this channel, which is a US government funded channel funded by the Voice of America, it's all in Russian. I was just watching the former Ukrainian national security advisor, who's a former McKinsey consultant, stalwart reformer, and was Zelensky's first national security advisor. And you just see him in military uniform. He's like my age. He's in his early mid 50s, and he's calling. He's a sharp critic of Zelensky, but he's saying we have to be united in dealing with this assault on our homeland. And so you see people like that rising to the occasion. And you see, just also how undefended people are and how unprepared they are. So this is horrible. I don't know. I mean, anyways, that's not a very original take, but that's where we are.
Yeah, and just talk more broadly about how did you react when you first heard that this was happening? I mean, I know it wasn't surprising to you, but still, when it happens, we go through some kind of emotional response that often takes us by surprise.
So, I mean, and I don't know if everybody listening to this can sort of think back to where they were in October or November of last year. But around that time, my colleague Eugene Rumer at Carnegie and I wrote a paper. And that paper, which was called Ukraine, Putin's Unfinished Business, laid out for us what we thought had changed in Russia's strategic calculus about Ukraine, and how this was real, the threat of war was real, and Putin's determination to seize what he believed was a tactical opening was going to blow everything up. And we laid this all out. Papers available. I can put it in the chat. I don't know if that, maybe I shouldn't put it in the chat so your readers, well, maybe you can post it along with this file. Yeah. But that paper garnered a ton of attention. We circulated it in samizdat form before it was publicly released. And it just kind of explained why this was going to happen. And I was hoping I was wrong. Like, I'm not a mind reader, but I really felt like there was a real, that something had fundamentally changed. And I think the part that was different So I'm not really answering your question. I mean, I'm in despair. I mean, this is very shocking and just on all levels transformative moment for humanity, not just for people who study this part of the world. But I think the key point, and I think this gets lost in all the kind of endless instant analysis, is that what Putin saw happening in Ukraine was not something that was like a clear and present danger, but something that he believed that if you extrapolate out 10 years, 20 years, was just going to get worse and worse. And the thing that he saw that was going to get worse and worse was basically, in the analogy we used in our paper, that the West had parked a big aircraft carrier off the coast of southern Russia. And every year the West was going to pump in hundreds of millions of dollars to bolster Ukraine's military, intelligence, cyber, and political subversion capabilities, and that was going to be parked right next door to Russia. And so historically, Russia has always relied on the idea that there needs to be a big buffer between Russia and threats to the West. And that sort of what they call strategic depth is what saved Russia from the Nazi invasion. It saved them from Napoleon. And it allows them to kind of, sort of fall back and fight. And they have, huge capabilities to do that. And huge national reserves of both capability in the military area as well as ability to take pain. And like, that's what, you saw that with the deaths of 27 million Russians in World War II. That's what saved, the Western world, right? Right. So it's not a crazy premise. But the view that Ukraine's not a real country, that's deeply etched in Putin's behavior since the mid-2000s. And saying that to anyone who will listen, people tended to think that's crazy talk and the world had changed. Ukraine is a real country. But what we're seeing, and this comes to the crux of everything of like why this is happening, is he smelled the opening and he saw, and wrongly or rightly, but he believes Joe Biden and Western European leaders are all weak and they're not able to stand up to this. He also, I think, believes that the Ukrainian government is a mess and they're not going to be able to stand up to this, so that they'll crack if the pressure is applied. And then the sort of unanswerable question at the moment is, what's the West going to do about it? Right. And, are we just going to accept watching Russia roll over Ukraine and foist a new government on the people who live there, or just blow it up? And in some ways, like, part of what we sort of miss when we think about Putin's behavior is we like to fix problems, and we're always thinking like, if we do something, will the thing that replaces what we just smashed be better or, sustainable? And we're just wired that way. Russia doesn't solve problems in its policymaking. It often deliberately creates problems that it thinks will be better than the pre-existing status quo. And I think that's partly on display here. So they're, the way they're fighting this war, their war aims, it's all very over the top, but it's not aimed at kind of having a beautiful new Ukraine that will be this kind of Putinized Ukraine. Like they're pretty happy to live with a broken, messed Ukraine that then they, have demilitarized, as Putin said, and won't pose the threat that I was describing earlier.
So 20 questions occurred to me while you were talking, but there are about three.
I was talking too long. Right?
Well, there are about 3 or 4 points that I definitely want to hit before we run out of time. So first, talk to people about the Zelensky government. There was an op-ed in the Times a couple of days ago by someone who wrote, I'm sure you saw it, that he was in way above his head. He's just a TV entertainer. His tenure has been kind of a disaster. None of this obviously is to excuse what's going on from the Kremlin. I don't know, what is the accurate observation in your view of what the Zelensky government has been like?
So Zelensky came into office on this, kind of unbelievable populist upsurge, right? And sort of was a candidate out of nowhere who offered a very angry and tired and destitute public an alternative to what they've seen for 30 plus years, which is this kind of state capture where oligarchs and corrupt interests dominate the state. And, they live horribly in Ukraine. It's one of the 2 poorest countries in Europe. So they have every right to be mad. And so a populist who, had been on TV and played this kind of everyman role, there was something alluring to the idea of like, throw all the bums out. He came with no political party. He built all this up basically out of nowhere. but it hasn't gone well. So he's now basically, his popularity rating has plummeted to the teens. He was at 70+% when he was elected. And his behavior in office has really confirmed that, this deeply entrenched system of state capture and corruption runs rampant. But what's, I think, most troubling was that there was a sort of breakdown in US-Ukrainian relations that occurred, and that started under Donald Trump, who really, threw Ukraine under the bus, both as a candidate and then as president.
Yeah.
And so in the war, phase one, 2014, 2015, you had this just close interlocking set of relationships between American and Ukrainian officials. And the government at the highest level was still subject to the model I described of state capture and oligarchic control and, cronyism and corruption at astonishingly, at astonishing scale. But in terms of the way the government functioned, the embrace was really, really close. And what happened over time, I'm not letting Zelensky off the hook for this, but that attenuated. And so we just don't have a government to government interconnection for going on, starting in 2017. So that starts under Poroshenko, but then accelerates under Zelensky. And now the thing which I had the Ukrainian National Security Advisor, I mentioned him earlier, on a panel a couple of weeks ago, and he said that Zelensky's ruling style is very similar to Trump's, and he's basically disempowered the entire government and made it impossible for anybody who wants guidance or a policy decision taken to have any authority. So it's all on him, similar with Trump, and because his instincts are all over the place, it's really hard to get the right decision or to get it from other people than the president himself.
Interesting. Okay, now let me move on to this topic. I'd like your view on the NATO expansion. You probably
No, I'm not going to talk about that, man. The Russians want us to talk about that stuff.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's what I want to know. I mean, does that doesn't figure in here to you?
So I'm going to be I'm not joking around. The Russians want to destroy a sovereign, independent Ukraine. That's what this is about. It's not about, did somebody hurt Putin's feelings by enlarging NATO? Or even making a kind of theoretical promise at some point to bring countries like Ukraine into NATO. That's not what this is about. But the Russians know all too well that by saying that's what this is about, that they can trigger Western experts and government officials and people who engage in coulda, woulda, shoulda till the end of time. And it's a complicated history, and we can spend 20 seconds talking about the complicated history. But the reality is that instead of spending the last 4 months talking about unbelievable cruelty, savagery, and violence committed by the sovereign government of Russia against a neighboring independent country, we could have spent usefully the last 4 months boning up on what Russia's done for 8 years. And instead, it's this kind of like, did James Baker say something at some point in an incautious way? And what was the point of this? And the thing it triggers is two things. One, it triggers a debate in the US about, did this get mismanaged and were mistakes made? Two, it triggers the nativist, kind of isolationist attitudes in the US, partly, correctly, that we have allies and responsibilities in Europe that are not commensurate, that, like people don't pay their way. So there's a lot of free riding. That's a perennial problem. And in Europe, it triggers a discussion of why is America here? Why is America bossing us around after the Cold War? And it plays on those residual resentments. So an anti-Americanism, which is never far from the surface, but that's deliberate. Let's talk about the fact that Russia went to war for no good reason 8 years ago, and now is taking it to the nth level. That's, to me, the story, and everything else is details.
So let's get to the $1 million question of what Putin wants here. You alluded earlier in the conversation to some different possibilities, and I've been reading these things. Anatol Lieberman had an interesting thing that I read this morning. He either wants just to have those eastern provinces in the Donbas region under his control as autonomous states within Ukraine or something, or maybe he wants to throw Zelensky out and put in his own puppet regime or something in between, or to move the West back in some respects. So what do you think is his goal here?
I don't think it's ambiguous, Michael, and I don't think it's $1 million question. If I can get paid $1 million by telling you the answer, I can send you my Venmo. No, he's trying to destroy Ukraine. He cannot live with an independent, sovereign Ukraine, and he doesn't want it ruled by its own people. And let's just remember, Ukraine, remarkably, for the past 30 odd years, elects its head of state in free and fair elections in a competitive media environment with real, accountable, real elections, that are free of significant manipulation. Ukraine's a messed up country, but it has really horrible governance, and people have horrible socioeconomic conditions. But that's a remarkable track record, and it has a really vibrant civil society that actually debates and engages and pushes its government. And then there's this great pincer movement over the past 8 years since the last revolution of dignity, restructured the country in 2014, where civil society partners with Western governments and they put a pincer on their government to do serious reforms. That is remarkable. And that is what Putin has no interest in seeing survive this war. So I don't think he sits around thinking, oh God, and there's a debate in Western circles about does Putin worry that model might somehow seem more attractive to Russians than what they got. A, I don't think he cares what Russians think. And B, I don't think there's a ton of attractive power inside Russia itself for Ukraine. I think they've kind of tarnished the image of Ukraine so thoroughly within the Russian elite and within the Russian population more generally. But anyways, point is he's on a mission from God, to borrow from the Blues Brothers, to destroy Ukraine. And he's going to take it over or break it and kill the leaders. And that's where we're at. We're in a world where, savage retribution is what he's threatening. And anyone who doubts the way I'm portraying this just needs to watch what Vladimir Putin said today on national TV. His comments are chilling, and it's not subtle. He says that the people of Ukraine have to rise up and rid themselves of the drug addicts and neo-Nazis that run their government, and needs to string them up. And and then the implication is that they don't do it, I will. And that's who he's using this kind of lurid terminology that's full of allusions to neo-Nazis and things like that. And
what does he ostensibly mean by neo-Nazis? I mean,
so no, he uses this framing, and this has been something that the Russians have been doing since the revolution of 2014, to refer to partisan groups that were part of this very complex interplay in the war, the sort of World War II period and the post-World War II period, who made cause with Hitler, who then broke with Hitler, who engaged in fascist behavior, who were fascists. They were actual fascists. Sometimes they were pro-Nazi fascists, sometimes they were anti-Nazi fascists, and who engaged in mass killing of Poles and Jews and other minorities. So he uses that imagery and the fact that the sort of legitimacy of the Russian state, and I'm sorry to get wonky, but the legitimacy of the person who sits in the Kremlin is derived from the fact that they defeated Nazism in World War II. And that's the kind of, the word Russians use is the sacralizing event. And it's that from God and God-given authority that Putin vests in himself, and that he now uses to justify war against a government in a friendly neighboring country made up of people who look and smell and act like Russians in large respects. There's plenty of historical and other cultural differences between Russians and Ukrainians, but it's not stuff that would ever force anyone to suggest these are two peoples who should be at war. It's all
we should quickly make clear to people that during the war, the vast majority of Ukrainians, as I understand it, fought with the Red Army, right, against Germany. And this was even after Stalin starved them to death, millions of them.
Yes, so it was a part of the Soviet Union, and Ukrainians played a huge role in powering the Soviet Union to superpower status.
Let's finally, let's finish up in about 3 minutes, but let's talk about the West and the sanctions and what you're seeing as the dynamic between the United States and the EU right now, and where you think the sanctions regime should go.
So let me do this in stylistic form. The sanctions that are being unleashed against the Russian economy are far-reaching, and they're going to have spectacular effects. And it will make Russia toxic. It will disrupt day-to-day life. And then longer term, due to the sort of use of these measures that we used against, the US government used against Huawei, beginning of the Trump administration, and then more broadly during the Biden era, there's going to be a piper who gets paid. And this is going to result in continued underdevelopment and economic backwardness and technological underdevelopment in Russia writ large. The problem structurally is that Vladimir Putin is loaded with cash, and he has been hardening the Russian economy for not just the past 8 years, but even longer, to reduce vulnerabilities to sudden stop type events like we're seeing right now. And the challenge is twofold. The way the Russian government funds itself every single day is it pumps stuff out of the ground and it sells it for dollars on world markets. All of the sanctions that have been announced create carve-outs and exclusions that allow Russia to continue to do that, because obviously Russia is a major oil producer and we do not want to take Russia's oil off the market. We don't want to create an economic calamity for ourselves. But every day that Russia does this, and here's where I'll finish just to give you a practical way to pin how much we're talking about. Every day, Russia pumps 4.3 million barrels of oil onto world markets. It exports that amount. And if oil is priced at $100 a barrel right now, you do the math, that's a lot of cash. And that's why Russia today, I know oil prices fluctuate, has over $630 billion in its piggy bank, which is 40% of Russia's GDP, to basically allow them to ride out tough times. So you tell me, that is very different in scale than the problem we faced with North Korea, the problem we faced with Iran, where like people really threw the book at those countries. We're not doing that with Russia.
Yeah. Last thing, real quick. At the very beginning of our chat, you alluded to the fact that the Red Army was a bit bogged down.
The Russian army, dude.
Russian Army.
The Red Army.
Right, sorry. Oops. Similar in spirit anyway, I suppose.
I wouldn't say bogged down. I would say making less headway, and more slowly than they expected.
Yeah. So do you have any guesses as to a timetable? Like if they get into Kyiv, will that be days, weeks?
I don't know. I mean, I'm still very gloomy. I'll be really blunt with you. I think it's when you see Putin go in with this level of savagery and only go in part way right now, right? He has only deployed a portion of the forces he's got.
Yeah.
And he's got everything at stake. So he's just gonna keep pushing. And because there's no sense of, I might have to be called in front of a congressional committee to explain why there were civilian casualties, or why this was like completely an over the top and horrible thing that's going to hurt Russia for decades to come. Like there's no accountability. So I just expect him to basically decimate Ukraine, and we're going to be left with a horrible crisis. It's going to consume huge amounts of President Biden's time and his team's time. So it just reduces the time available for other stuff. And then it's going to be a call on both, the U.S. as a country to cough up more for things like defense in this part of the world, as well as challenge. We can't do all the things we want to do. There's just going to be trade-offs.
Andrew Weiss, the Carnegie Endowment, learned a lot. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks so much.